Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 100th edition of the Asia Impact webinar hosted by the Asian Development Bank. At this point, I would like to thank and congratulate our colleagues Jose Zeglich, Abdullah, and Mel for spearheading the AIW initiative to disseminate ADB's knowledge work since June 2020. I am Joseph Maria Singham, Principal Statistician in the Data Division of the Asian Development Bank. I'll be the moderator for this webinar. Today, we are very excited to share the 56th edition of our flagship publication, The Key Indicators for Asia and the Pacific, which was released earlier today. Just as in our previous publications, this report offers valuable insights into the region's socio-economic landscape. During this webinar, we will present our work based on the environmentally extended input-output statistical analytical framework as a salient feature of this year's report. We will detail how the framework enables us to discern the environmental impact of economic activities and the economic impact of climate action. Our presenters today are Nomundari Bhatar and Shambhavi Shawnee, who are part of the team that authored this report. Without further ado, over to you, Nomko and Shambhavi.
Thank you, Joseph. Let me start by outlining some key messages of our report and our presentation today. In today's highly connected global economy, where the production of goods and services is becoming increasingly international, the environmental challenges are inherently cross-border and therefore require regional cooperation and partnership in climate action. Reducing emissions is key to achieving development goals, given the strong association between higher emissions and extreme weather events that cause shocks to agriculture, infrastructure, and productivity. ADB's environmentally extended multi-regional input-output analytical framework provides this data foundation. It bridges a critical gap in the evidence needed by linking emission inventories with statistics on production, consumption, and trade. The data is disaggregated by sector and economy and can be used to support policies like carbon tax and carbon trading. Our analysis shows that Asia and the Pacific, as the manufacturing hub of the world, bears disproportionately greater environmental costs since the emissions caused by the region's consumption demand is significantly lower than the emissions attributed to its production to meet global demand for goods and services. The sector-specific analysis shows that while emissions per dollar of output of the region's agriculture is on par with the global average, its emissions intensity in utilities is the highest across all regions. This presents an opportunity to expand renewable energy and upgrade power infrastructure to reduce emissions while also supporting the growing energy needs of the region. We will now briefly explain how this report details the input-output analysis-based emissions measures of sustainability across various stages of economic production and how they can be used to inform policy. Over the last 10 years, our team has been producing the multi-regional input-output tables to serve the statistical, analytical, and policy needs of internal and external stakeholders alike. Our data is used in all major publications of the Economic Research and Development Indicators Department at the ADB and other international and multilateral organizations. It is also used increasingly by national central banks around the world. The ADB MRIO tables are compiled annually. The initial motivation for producing these tables was to study the effects of the global financial crisis, the expansion of global production networks, and the emerging trade tensions. Analysis based on our database has also been featured in mainstream media such as the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and The Economist. To meet the analytical needs related to emerging development issues, under KI 2025, we have integrated the MRIO tables with emissions-related data, which forms the basis of this report. This year, the release includes economy and sector-level emissions data for 72 economies, plus rest of the world, covering 35 industries, 37 emission sources, 4 greenhouse gases for a period of 6 years between 2017 and 2023. And of course, this is harmonized with the accounting principles of the system of national accounts. Between 1970 and 2023, emissions have risen significantly across all regions of the world. And today, Asia and the Pacific contributes to nearly half of all global emissions. This is not a surprise, as the region is home to some of the largest and fastest growing economies and to 60% of the global population. The top emitters globally are also in Asia and the Pacific, such as the People's Republic of China, contributing about 30% to global greenhouse gas emissions, India at 8%, Indonesia at 2.3%, Japan at 2%. By contributing significantly to greenhouse gases, the region also heightens its own exposure to climate risks. In the last few years, we have seen an uptick in extreme weather events, the human and economic costs of which are borne disproportionately by developing economies. Unpredictable weather patterns lead to crop failures and threaten nutrition, and droughts worsen water scarcity. Natural disasters damage infrastructure and disrupt key service deliveries, and heat and weather-related disruptions lower productivity and economic output. Vulnerable populations are not only hit the hardest, but also recover the slowest, and communities are left with fewer resources to adapt or rebuild. This is why today's complex development challenges need attention and fast action to build resilience for the most vulnerable populations. Tracking emissions at the economy and sector level is an important step to tackling the emerging climate risks. The ADB's environmentally extended multi-regional input-output table aims to demonstrate how statistical gaps can be filled by linking emissions and economic activity at the economy and sector level. The core accounts, which have been in place since 2014, capture the economic flows. These accounts cover intermediate demand, which are flows between sectors, and final demand, which is consumed by households, governments, and through investments. This framework has informed trade and policy decisions for a decade. We are now expanding this with satellite accounts, which adds environmental data such as greenhouse gas emissions, which enhances the table's analytical value. This allows for deeper insights into the environmental impact of trade and supply chains and caters to users concerned with sustainability. With this addition, the inter-industry transactions now show how input and output track direct and indirect emissions, which are embedded within the value chains. The EEMRIO does this for 72 individual economies plus rest of the world, as to reflect emissions of imported goods and services for a more global coverage. It also provides sectoral level details for 35 unique sectors and 37 different emission sources. Currently, the EEMRIO covers 93% of global GDP, 87% of global trade, 85% of greenhouse gas emissions, and 75% of the global population. This extensive reach enables comprehensive tracking of both economic activity and emissions, critical for addressing global climate challenges. While similar databases exist, the ADB EEMRIO is more comprehensive in terms of its coverage and covers 29 ADB regional members, and we plan for it to be produced at regular intervals. In the process of building this database, the ADB MRIO is still at the heart of the compilation, as it is the underlying source of information for tracing the flows of goods and services from source emitter to the ultimate user. Therefore, ADB, with its experience in building MRIO tables, together with its relationship with national statistics offices in the region, is in a position to extend the MRIO with emerging data needs. This framework is versatile and flexible to incorporate other data and indicators related to gender and social protection to include key development priorities as needed. My colleague Nompo will now walk us through some key results.
Thank you, Shambhavi. I will now introduce some of the key findings that are covered in the KI 2025 report. And as Shambhavi has mentioned, one of the most significant applications of the environmentally extended MRIOT framework is its ability to measure decoupling indicators on both an economy and sector level. By linking emissions data with economic output, the framework can evaluate whether economic growth is achieved with reduced environmental impacts. So this analysis is essentially an understanding whether economies are moving towards the decoupling of economic growth from emissions growth. As you can see from the graph here, there's been much progress that has been made between 2017 to 2023 in weakening the link between economic expansion and accelerating emissions in individual economies. This chart shows on a regional basis between 2017 to 2023 whether countries have been able to decouple economic growth from emissions. At the top here, we can see economies that have not decoupled yet in the past 6 years. Under the 45-degree line and above the zero axis, we can see economies that have relatively decoupled, meaning that both are growing, but the economic growth is growing at a higher pace than the emissions growth. And at the bottom, we can see economies that have been able to absolutely decouple, meaning that the economic growth has been growing while the emissions has decreased, the growth has decreased. We can see from this graph here that most of the economies in the Asia and the Pacific region are in the relative decoupling stage, whereas other economies in other regions, such as Europe, have been absolutely decoupling. Of course, we understand that this is data from 2017 to 2023, and more long-term data is needed to establish long-term trends, but this is promising results that we can establish with our framework. Furthermore, while these results reflect the interim use of current price gross domestic product, sensitivity checks that we have done using constant prices suggest that the direction of decoupling trends remains stable in nearly 9 out of 10 cases. So these diverse outcomes highlight the need for tailored policies to hasten progress towards absolute decoupling, particularly in regions where economic growth is still heavily dependent on carbon-intensive activities and demand from other regions. In an interconnected world, actions and decisions that are taken in one part of the world affect the growth and development in another. Production is fragmented and distributed across the world. So the multi-regional input-output statistical facilities enable us to map out production processes not only within an individual economy, but also production processes from end to end, linking sector to sector and economy to economy. The integration of the environmental components into the MROTs enables us to directly measure the environmental impact of production. Due to the upstream and downstream processes that we are able to measure, we can not only trace direct emissions, but also indirect emissions that are passed on to other economies. This supports evidence-based policymaking, especially in the space of regional cooperation for supporting actions related to the environment. Beyond accounting for direct and indirect emissions, the input-output framework also allows users to assess not just where emissions occur, but why they're rising or falling. With structural decomposition analysis, we can attribute shifts in environmental indicators to specific underlying factors, such as changes to emissions intensity, changes to intermediate input composition, and changes to final demand. Again, not only on a regional level, but also on an economy level as well. Here, for example, looking at the recent trends, we see that scale effects have driven the global rise in emissions amid improvements in intensity. From 2017 to 2023, emissions declined by around 20% due to a fall in emissions intensity. However, an increase in global demand surged emissions by 27.5% over the same time period. As such, the increase in global demand offset the reductions gained by emissions intensity improvements by 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So here we see that while the decline in global emissions intensity from 2017 to 2023 reflects technological progress and structural efficiency, the overwhelming growth in economic demand underscores the challenges of achieving absolute decoupling or reductions in total emissions. So without coordinated efforts to curb growth and final demand or radically improve emissions efficiency, global emissions are likely to continue rising. It is also noteworthy that although the overall emission levels have increased in Asia and the Pacific, the region's emission intensity, which is measured as the emissions per dollar of output, declined by 13% in the same time period. And furthermore, because of the EMROT's aggregation levels, we can derive emissions intensities for 35 sector categorizations, which helps drive sector-specific policies. So in the next 2 slides, the sectors are grouped into 6 sectoral groupings: agriculture, utilities, waste, industries, transport and travel, and services. And in Asia and the Pacific, we see that the emission intensities of all the 6 aggregate sectors are declining. And here it's important to note that while the region's agricultural emissions intensity is in line with global trends, those for utilities are well above the trends for every other region of the world. And furthermore, while industries has a lower emissions intensity compared to the previous sectoral groups, Asia and the Pacific still has a higher emissions intensity than the global average. Therefore, regional cooperation in climate action, such as the development of cleaner regional electricity grids, is needed to reduce both emission levels and intensities even further. We also analyze emissions from production-based and consumption-based lenses, where the production-based approach measures emissions based on where goods and services are produced, and consumption-based lens measures emissions based on where the carbon-embedded goods are consumed, as in the final demand. Production-based emission levels and growth dominates in Asia and the Pacific as the region is the factory of the world, and most of the carbon-intensive products are produced here. However, it's a slightly different story when we look at the emissions from a consumption-based lenses. While Asia and the Pacific had lower consumption-based emissions compared to the rest of the world, over time it is catching up, and in 2023 it has surpassed the other regions. However, this understanding supports a little bit when we look at the emissions on a per capita basis, as the region's emissions have been lower, per capita have been lower than the rest of the world, both from the production as well as the consumption-based lenses. As alluded to previously, the interconnected structure of input-output tables allows the tracing of emissions throughout the entire supply chains. This reveals not only the direct emissions of each sector, but also the indirect emissions embedded in the inputs the sector consumes. So for example, for many sectors, Scope 3 emissions, which are indirect emissions other than those from energy providers, constitute a significant portion of total emissions, highlighting the crucial role of upstream supply chain activities. As you can see here on the left chart, the emissions footprint by sector and scope in Asia and the Pacific reveals that while in the utilities, agriculture, and waste sectors, most of the emissions are concentrated in the Scope 1, we see that in the travel and transport, industries, and services, which are very interconnected sectors, the emissions are concentrated in the Scope 2 and 3 emissions. And then, for example, if we look at the agricultural sector in Asia and the Pacific in 2023, we see that 90% of the total emissions footprint was attributable to direct emissions from owned and controlled sources, such as food production, construction, and services needed to produce agricultural goods. Around 1% was from indirect Scope 2 emissions from purchased energy, such as electricity for heating and lighting. And lastly, 9% were Scope 3 emissions from upstream activities in the value chain, typically undertaken by third-party entities, such as emissions from fuel, fertilizers, and product transportation. And it's important to note here that Scope 2 emissions only refer to indirect emissions from a sector's own purchases of electricity, steam, heating, or cooling, and they do not include emissions from electricity purchased by sector suppliers because those are counted under Scope 3. So for example, when a farmer uses electricity to run irrigation systems, those emissions are in the farmer Scope 2 emissions, but if the farmer buys fertilizer from a manufacturer, which in turn use electricity in making it, those emissions are the manufacturer's Scope 2 emissions, not the farmer's. So from the farmer's perspective, emissions from the electricity used to make fertilizer are Scope 3, and the electricity that it reports under its own use are under Scope 2, and this way we avoid double counting. So identifying emission scopes and their concentrations can help in setting more ambitious yet achievable decarbonization targets. This includes collaborating with suppliers to reduce emissions, improving energy efficiency in manufacturing, and embedding environmental criteria into supplier and purchasing agreements, measures that are already being taken in some industry groups. These results highlight the key findings of the KI 2025 report, and for more additional insights and reports, please go and check out our KI 2025 report. We have a much further detailed breakdown into sectoral and economy level analyses. And with this, I will hand it over back to Joseph to moderate the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shambhavi and Nomko, for the very insightful presentation. It neatly captures the essence of our report. Now let's proceed with the panel discussion. Let me introduce our panelists. Our panelists today are Albert Park, Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank, Pradeep Tharakan, Director responsible for energy transition at ADB, Jing Meng, Professor at University College London, and Sabah Abdullah, senior economist at ADB. At this point, let me ask each of our panelists to provide their reflections and insights on the report or a specific aspect of it. Let me start with the chief economist, Albert.
Hi, thanks, Joseph. Yeah, we're very proud of this report. I think the ability to compile country sector level emissions data and then link it with the input-output tables is quite powerful. Even if we just focus on the consistent measurement of emissions at sector level over time in different countries, that already is very helpful because it allows us to understand how emissions are changing over time with structural change. As you know, many economies are moving from more of an industrial share of the economy to more of the services, and services, of course, tend to be less emissions intensive. And so we can kind of anticipate opportunities for reducing emissions just through structural change. But then perhaps more useful to policymakers is that they can compare the emissions intensity of their activity in different sectors with other countries. So they can say, oh, our emissions intensity in a specific industry subsectors is greater than in other countries that are at similar level of them. So maybe we should look more closely at that so we can give them some signal about where there are opportunities. And it's very specific because it can document not just overall emissions, but different types and different sources of emissions. But then linking it to the input-output tables makes it, much more powerful. And it's because you can kind of see how emissions are linked across activities, both within economies, but also more importantly, perhaps, or more interestingly, across economies. And here, the results on being able to finally calculate, accurately consumption-based emissions, not just production-based emissions, I think is really important for thinking about how we think about responsibility for emissions. So in other words, even though we know that because Asia is the manufacturing area for much of the world, which increases emissions, it could be that a lot of the increased emissions in Asia or in specific economies that are successful exporters are really to support consumption in advanced economies. And so really is the responsibility for those emissions solely on those who produce it, or is it on those who consume it? In the end, it's really the behavior of consumers that drives the global demand. And so I think one thing that is interesting, even though Asia, which, is home of 60% of the world's population, Asia Pacific, it accounts for about half of the emissions, I think, and so you can see on a per capita basis, if we look at production, and those numbers I described are production, then it actually looks like Asia is producing a pretty high amount per capita. I mean, even slightly more than the rest of the world. Actually, total emissions is also over 60%, I think now. But if you look at consumption, it's a bit different. And by consumption per capita measures, Asia's still not responsible for as much emissions as the rest of the world, let alone comparisons with advanced economies who have much higher emissions per consumption unit. So I think that's important for thinking about the interlinkage of consumption and production and the responsibility for emissions in global debates about burden sharing, et cetera. But also it helps us understand that we can't just blame, foreign demand for increased emissions in Asia. So, for example, if you look at China, we did these numbers for China. The gap between consumption-based emissions and production-based emissions is about 8%. In other words, maybe 8% of the emissions produced in China are embodied in goods that are then exported to the rest of the world. But that means that 92%, or the vast majority of emissions that are produced in China, is to support consumption in China. And that emissions, consumption per capita emissions, is still much higher than in other parts of Asia, and now I think maybe even above global averages. So it's considerable and has been growing over time. And so if you look at emissions intensity by sector in China, there's still many sectors where China's emissions intensity, although it's come down over time, is still much less efficient, emissions efficient than other advanced economies. So there's plenty of room for still focusing on reducing the emissions intensity of production processes in China for the sake of the consumers in China and the sustainability of the environment. So all of that is very interesting. And then, of course, the other part is this ability to look separately at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, where you can now see, there are a lot of companies which say they want to be responsible not just for the emissions they produce, but for the emissions that their suppliers produce. So they don't want to buy too many inputs that are based on highly polluting processes or highly emissions intensive processes. And of course, this is at sector level, not at firm level, these statistics, but it could give insight for firms. For instance, a firm could say, oh, if I know I'm sourcing a lot of inputs from this sector, I could look at other countries and our data would be able to tell them, oh, the production of those inputs in this country is actually very emissions intensive compared to some other country. It could guide choice. Of course, at the end, you would want to know the emissions intensity of firm level outcomes. But I think it's a step in meeting those kind of information gaps and allowing countries, if not companies, to try to understand better how their demand for inputs is supporting activities that have different levels of emissions. And if they make choices to try to source cleaner, then obviously that has demand effects, which create stronger economic incentives for upstream sectors to reduce their emissions intensity as well. And of course, that's best embodied in the CBAM system, which is going to be implemented relatively soon, where they're trying to directly tax the emissions of imported goods. And so they need to have data that can accurately do that. So let me stop here. I think it's very powerful, and I think there's lots of interesting analysis that can be done, and just interesting tracking that governments can do to help understand where they are in terms of their own emissions relative to the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Albert, for those insightful reflections. Let me ask Pradeep for his comments.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for including me in this panel discussion. I'd like to focus on the trends that were described in the utility sector and the industrial sector. Perhaps we can focus on the utility sector first, and let me unpack the challenges and opportunities therein. As the study shows, not only does the Asia-Pacific region have high emissions intensity within the utility sector, but it's also got the highest annual growth rate in energy and electricity demand. And this can be expected to continue into the medium term as the region is still rapidly developing. For example, most of the power grids in large developing countries in the Asia Pacific are expected to grow by 2 to 4 times in the coming decades. And let's not forget that nearly 100 million people in the region still don't have access to electricity, and nearly 300 million, do not have access to adequate and reliable supply. So in effect, Asia Pacific doesn't have the luxury of developing first and then decarbonizing. It needs to develop and decarbonize simultaneously. And one of the biggest sort of challenges here is really that nearly 40% of the electricity generated in the region comes from coal. And in some countries, it's higher. So really, what are the solutions that we can deploy? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is we need to scale up renewable energy generation as fast as we can. And there is a lot to celebrate in the region. If you look across, PRC and India have been deploying renewables at world-leading levels. A lot more needs to be done. We need to focus on newer technologies like offshore wind, a combination of wind, solar, and energy storage hybrids so that we can firm up the supply of renewables, look at things like pumped hydropower storage. And we need to have more investment. I mean, in the case of India alone, annual investments in the clean energy space need to go from something like 60 billion per year to nearly 300 billion per year by most studies. Now, high levels of renewable energy generation bring with it its own challenges. This energy is variable, and so we need a lot of supplemental energy storage, and we need grid interconnections. That was mentioned as well. It's often now stated that there is no energy transition without transmission. So we need to really strengthen systems and then interconnect these systems with each other so that you have a larger balancing area so that renewable energy can be moved across large distances, but then also you can offset a sudden drop in generation in one area by bringing in power from the other areas. And this is particularly the case in terms of, archipelagic nations in the region. We have a few of those, and between countries and across regions. And going back to the whole issue of the coal-fired power plants, a lot of the power plants in the region are relatively young. They're about 15 years on average, and these are long-lived assets that live for 40 to 50 years, can be used for even longer, up to 60 years in some cases. Now, this contrasts with assets in other parts of the world, which are typically 40 to 50 years of age. And what we see in this region is these power plants are usually financed by state-owned utilities, or in a single buyer model, you've got the private sector that's contracted with a single buyer to be able to provide power at regulated prices and over long-term contracts, which means it's really difficult to get out of these contracts. And so if you don't really take care of this issue, you're going to see a massive increase in emissions coming from, over the next, say, 2 decades. Now, similarly, in the industrial sector, you're also seeing a lot of challenges. One is you've got industrial capacity is also slated to increase, both to meet local demand and consumption, but also for export purposes. Take the case of steel production. India's crude steel capacity went from about 100 million tons per year in 2015 to 200 million tons in 2025, expected to breach about 230 million tons by 2030. Across the ASEAN region, it's going to go from 80 million tons today to about 180 million tons by 2030. So we need to decarbonize the industrial sector, and the sequence of solutions are known, right? You've got to first ramp up industrial efficiency so we don't waste energy. Then that includes better waste management, waste heat recovery, materials recycling. Then you have to electrify so that you don't use fossil fuels for producing, high temperature heat, in some cases even a couple of thousand degrees. And then you have to switch to green fuels, green methanol, green ethanol, green hydrogen, and so on. And finally, the residual CO2 emissions that you really cannot deal with, you have to capture and either utilize them or store them through CCUS, or carbon capture, storage, and utilization. Now, this is not easy to do because you're really dealing with commodities, steel, chemicals, fertilizers. These are commodities. The focus is on producing them at bulk, as cheap as possible. You don't have carbon pricing or market signals. And so there really isn't a premium for these products. And so how do you actually signal the market to move in that direction? You can't make out a difference if you look at a steel rebar, whether it's green steel or not green steel, right? So you need standards, you need labels, you need traceability, supply chain related interventions, and so on and so forth. The other thing is, as we know, a bulk of the industrial capacity across Asia Pacific is still being, done by SMEs, 60% in most countries. So these are fragmented, low credit worthiness, lack of awareness, really difficult to sort of engage them to move forward in terms of decarbonization. And you got a plethora of technologies. A lot of them are not proven at scale. So again, this is the other sort of sector where we really need to focus on. If we don't, then again, you're going to see a huge increase in emissions intensity and in overall emissions in the next 2 to 3 decades. Let me stop here, Joseph. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, for bringing in the more practical aspects of the climate action challenge to the discussion. Now, let me ask Jing Meng for her reflections on the report.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for the organizers for this important discussion and also for this landmark report. This report is more than just an update of data. It represents a fundamental shift in how we must approach the sustainability challenge in our globalized economy. And my reflections today will focus on 3 key themes that I believe are most important takeaways. So the first one is about a powerful tool to review the hidden sustainability challenges. So the methodological heart of this report, the environmentally extended multi-regional input framework, is a very powerful tool. Our previous for long climate conversations have been limited by a focus on territorial production-based emissions in the current carbon mitigation targets, the NDC. This report moves us towards a more to a different perspective based on consumption-based accounting and also the emissions along the global supply chain. So it makes the invisible carbon emissions along the supply chain visible. It reveals the hidden carbon footprint embodied in the global value chain, the Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, as the report shows dominated sectors like services. By tracing the emissions from the final consumer back through every stage of production across the multiple boundaries, it moves the question from simply where does the emissions come out to the more difficult questions of who is driving the demand of the production and consumption. So it's a crucial step forward in accountability. The second point is the role of Asia Pacific countries. So this report highlights several the role of these regions in the production and also the global supply chain and also the implication for the future climate action. Asia is an engine of the global manufacture, so and responsible for about 60% of the global industrial emissions. But as a net exporter of goods and services, its production-based emissions are significantly higher than its consumption-based emissions. This confirms the challenge for the carbon leakage and also outsourcing the production activities and also the emission intensive production and also the related emissions to regions like Asia. I'm really impressed by the deep analysis about the hypothetical scenario of the shift of the textile production from Italy to Bangladesh. It's very powerful. It shows such a move or the change of the production activities from an economy to another economy, how it will affect the regional emissions and also the overall global emissions due to the gap in emissions intensity, and also the and another analysis about the about the impact of the supply chain for green products. I think it represents a new direction for how we can use MRL table for the deep analysis for the future actions for the carbon mitigation. And the third point I want to discuss is implication for the future shared responsibility and the targeted action. This data is not an end itself. Its purpose is to guide policy and action. So the key policy implication from this report is that decarbonization is a shared responsibility for policymakers in Asia. The focus must be tackling the source of production emissions by increasing the renewable energy and also improved energy efficiency or other clean technology deployment. And this report highlights the utilities and the industrial sectors are the highest emitters and rely heavily on the fossil fuels. So it's where the investment and also technological innovation are most needed. For policymakers in advanced economies, the report is a call to look beyond domestic borders and take responsibility for their consumption footprint. And this means actively supporting the green transition in their supply chain partners through technology transfer and green finance, and also trade policies that don't just export the environmental costs and also related emissions. So this report concludes that regional cooperations is not just desirable, it is imperative. In conclusion, this report and also the database have given us a powerful tool and also some key message to look at the global economy, it shows that the pathway forward requires us to move beyond the domestic responsibility, but also to shared global responsibility. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jing Meng, especially for highlighting the importance of input-output analysis in environmental-related studies. Let me ask Sabah for her comments.
Thank you so much. And I would like to first and foremost thank my colleagues for this brilliant work that they did in doing the analysis, especially. Let me just highlight scope 1, 2, and 3. I may overlap my response to Albert, Pradeep, and other colleagues, but I'll be very brief to summarize how important this work is, especially what we've just seen on scope 3. And we've seen that structural changes that are happening already in Asia, specifically on scope 3. We are seeing also that we're not only talking about environmentally material outputs or figures, that is from the GHG emissions, but we are seeing that more is needed in linking that to economically material figures, whether it's productivity, output, and labor. And then when you translate all this challenges, which this report tried to link it together very well in that environmental to the economic linkages so far, if you take this then and you try to ask yourself, what does this mean to competitiveness? Now, this is where financial material risks will come in for firm level. And we are seeing now from standards and disclosures, monitoring and reporting of direct emission 1 and 2 and 3. And we know scope 3 is the most difficult, almost all at firm level. 70 or 60% of their emissions are coming from scope 3. And so we are also seeing disclosures around the world, whether it's advanced countries or developing countries following sort of an IFRS, which are sustainable, or ICCB. These are all international sustainability reporting that are in place for companies all around the world. And so in this relationship, what is important is highlighting how these scope 3 are being disclosed, but in that regard, to the bottom line of companies in capital allocation and their loss, any losses that they are experiencing, and that's called double materiality in terms of their revenue to the impact, which is the consumption at the very end and production. I'll just stop here just to say I'm happy to chime in later on.
Thank you very much, Sabah, especially for bringing attention to the related issues, which we also highlight in our report. Now, let us move on to the question and answer session. Now, I will ask the first questions to our panelists and then open the floor for questions from the participants. So let me ask Albert, Chief Economist, the very first question. So the question is, how critical are such knowledge initiatives as the compilation of the environmentally extended multi-regional input-output table and other statistical frameworks to ADB strategic priority on climate action?
Right. I mean, I think increasingly, ADB views its strategy on climate action to really be a broader strategy for supporting sustainable development. But of course, since most emissions are coming from Asia, then and Asia is vulnerable to higher temperatures caused by greater emissions, I think as a region, we certainly have a very strong incentive to reduce emissions to avoid those negative impacts of higher temperatures that have been well described. Asia is much more vulnerable than other places. But there are other development outcomes too that really hinge on reducing emissions. Emissions is highly associated with pollution and thus health outcomes and productivity outcomes of people. In addition, now emissions, if we rely on fossil fuels, we're losing opportunities to actually produce energy cheaper through renewables, which is now a dominant kind of more cost-effective technology, which can save resources. And for countries that need to import fossil fuels, of course, that also uses foreign exchange to purchase those, and there are benefits to reducing emissions by shifting to renewables. So broadly, reducing emissions is a hugely important development goal. And for ADB, I think the knowledge work that is captured by some of the results that were presented today, I think, can help ADB engage with governments to identify the opportunities for where emissions can be reduced the most. And I think Pradeep did a good job explaining how important meeting that challenge is and showing countries where they stand and where they need to go, especially to meet their own NDC commitments. So again, if you can compare your energy intensity and certain activities to other countries and also to your own performance in the past, you can get a sense of where opportunities are. And that could actually also help ADB figure out which countries and which sectors they could get that there's more opportunities, either through, and that could either be through carbon pricing initiatives, emission trading systems, or other types of carbon taxes, or just removing fossil fuel subsidies. But it also could be through opportunities to introduce cleaner technologies to different types of producers, especially in the industrial sector. And we know that clean technology is often associated with greater productivity as well for firms who adopt. So all of those I view as opportunities. And of course, now with carbon pricing becoming transborder through the CBAM initiative, countries also need to think about strategies for documenting the emissions of embodied in the goods that they produce. And so data that can help explain that and document the amount of emissions embodied in exported goods can actually help countries from being unfairly taxed, and can maybe lay the basis also for developing systems that can more accurately measure emissions, not just at broad sector levels, but as I said, at firm level, or at least more disaggregate sector levels, which would be, of course, of great importance. So I think this knowledge, product innovation, and this data innovation that's now available to everyone to use should be provide very useful knowledge insights that can help ADB's engagement with their developing member countries.
Great. Thank you very much, Albert. So Pradeep, could you highlight some of ADB's key initiatives related to this strategic priority on climate action?
Sure. Yeah, I think maybe just let me pick up three different new initiatives I think that I'd like to highlight, but just broadly a plug for ADB. So just so that all the participants are aware, in 2024, ADB provided about 4.2 billion in financing for the energy sector, and we hope to grow to about 7 billion by 2026. Of this, about 25% is in the private sector, and the rest is in the sovereign or the government sector. Most of this financing is going towards solar, wind, hydropower. We're also getting into areas like waste to energy, and a lot of our investments are also in the transmission distribution build out and energy efficiency. So this is our so-called business as usual, if you will. But as we look to the future, I think three things that especially the report highlighted we are working on. The first is sort of the problem of the early retirement of coal assets. And we've seen that's a huge issue and will continue to be a drain on the emissions profile. So ADB is developing models and pilots for early retirement and repurposing of coal plants and fossil fuel plants in general, and replacing it with clean energy. We call it the energy transition mechanism. So that's one of them. The second is this whole idea of regional power grids and how they are a prerequisite for the transition. So let me focus on one region, which is the ASEAN. So there is a lot of talk about the ASEAN Power Grid, or APG. So this is really a network of 18 interconnections that, if built, would really make a huge difference in this part of the world in terms of increased renewable energy access and better reliable systems. So this is about $16 billion in financing. And ADB had pioneered one of the first interconnections in this area on the island of Borneo between Malaysia and West Kalimantan in Indonesia. So we are working with bilateral, multilateral partners and our ASEAN client countries to support the APG. Proposals include a project readiness facility, a transition finance facility, and technical assistance. Our president has announced that ADB stands ready to provide up to $10 billion in financing over the next 10 years through the public and the private routes. And last, I really want to highlight a very exciting initiative, and this is particularly relevant. It didn't really come out through the report, but I think it's definitely sort of the flavor of the year, if you will, is the whole role of critical minerals and manufacturing supply chains in supporting the energy transition. We as a society are really moving away from using fuels like wood, biomass, coal, gas to using huge amounts of minerals, materials, and equipment to support the energy transition. And I'm talking about things like graphite, lithium, cobalt, silica, and so on. So we are now, in July, ADB has announced its intention to re-enter the mining space. Our board approved a program called the Critical Minerals to Manufacturing Initiative for the clean energy transition and digitization. So this is going to help us assist our clients in the entire value chain from critical minerals mining to refining to processing to the manufacture of the clean energy equipment that we need, namely wind turbines, EV batteries, electrolyzers, and solar PV panels, and so on. And right after the approval of that board direction, ADB approved a financing package for a transformative copper gold mine in Pakistan called the Reko Diq project. I won't take too much time going into details on that project, but information is available on our website and so on. So a quick sort of plug on the three sort of major initiatives that we're working on that directly address some of the findings of the report. Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. Jing, Meng, given that we have employed the input-output framework for this analysis, could you explain what other sources and methods that we can use to take this work forward?
Okay, thank you, Joseph. I want to mention 2 points. It's also the direction we are moving forward with our new database. So the first point is to move beyond the sector level average. So in most of the current MRO framework, we use UN country data or other sector level economic data. But for the future move from the policy application to climate action, I think we are able to we can leverage the power of more granular data from the sector average to the firm level relatives. We can leverage the corporate disclosure and also the ESG database to integrate the firm level data to show what's the difference between the sector average to the firm level carbon emissions intensity and also the other energy efficiencies. So it allows for much more targeted policies and also for the target actions from the firm level. The second point is to broadening the scope so we can move beyond the carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So this report focuses on the greenhouse gases, but sustainability is about more than just carbon. So we can also consider other environmental accounts like water accounts, land use, and biodiversity accounts. So this ensures we are pursuing a sustainable path, balancing climate goals with other nature capitals or ecology. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jing Meng. Sabah, as we take this work forward, what other key aspects of climate resilience and climate action could we focus on, especially given this framework detail in the report?
Thank you so much. I think what we heard today is very important, and keywords that we just heard is carbon leakages. We've heard about this disparity between production and consumption. We've heard the fact that switching to renewable and green technologies, all these three. I'm just mentioning these three so far. What I'm paraphrasing, but looking forward, I think also what is important is thinking about regulation, the compliance, regulation for different countries, and the role of market instruments that we are already seeing. CBAM is one. We are seeing ETS on it. We are seeing carbon tax, and those differentials between and among countries and trade would be so important in moving this agenda forward on climate. But also touching upon what Jing just mentioned, it's not only about climate action, but we're also seeing more about environmental losses that are coming from biodiversity, from the land use. So it's a step-by-step process as we move forward with more data, with more granularity. Yeah, I will stop here for now, but there's more to be done. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabah. So let's go to the questions from the audience. The first question is related to regional cooperation. So how can a country like Pakistan benefit from regional cooperation in the area of climate action? Pradeep, would you provide some insights?
Okay, I realize we don't have a lot of time, so maybe just to hit the few highlights. I think Pakistan is particularly interesting. I was looking at some numbers just yesterday that show that in recent months, and maybe in the last 2 years, Pakistan has added more solar energy capacity than India and China. That is sobering. Nearly 40 gigawatts of solar has come into the country. And this is really happening because people were just tired of having poor and access to electricity and unreliable access to electricity. So they found solar as a cheaper and more reliable way to do this. Now that's that's the good trend, right? People have gone off the grid. Now, the adverse impact of that, and this goes to show that transitions are not easy, you often see adverse, inadvertent impacts, is that when people go off the grid, the already struggling utility, which was making huge losses, has now seen its customers going off, and now it has even poorer service, and the costs go up for the few people that are left on the grid. So you see that sort of regressive behavior, and you've got practically a huge problem in the entire power sector. So that's just to show us how transition is never easy, and there are so many different factors. So it's not a linear process at all. Solar good, therefore do more of it. Not necessarily. You end up with these kinds of situations. In terms of regional cooperation, look, I think interconnections would definitely be a huge positive. I mean, being able to, as I said, balance across a larger region. You could also have gas pipelines to bring in cleaner, fossil fuels to displace, say, traditional biomass or coal in many cases. That's another way of doing it. And eventually, once you have green fuels, these pipelines can also double up and help you move those green fuels as well. So I think those are sort of the ideas that sort of come to mind quickly. And also, if you look at the air quality problems that we're seeing all across that region, it's really a transboundary problem all across Pakistan, Lahore, Punjab area, and a good part of northern India as well. So again, it goes to show that transboundary problems like, air pollution often stems from sort of energy use patterns. And so we also potentially should look for ways in which perhaps Pakistan can collaborate more with regional players from the Central West, which have surplus gas, surplus electricity perhaps, and then set up regional cooperation frameworks. Let me stop here, Joseph. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Pradeep. I think we can take one question. So how could countries balance the need for economic development with a reduction of carbon emissions? Albert?
Well, I actually think, as I was trying to say earlier, it's maybe a false choice, right? I think reducing emissions in many ways is supportive of economic development and growth. Renewable energy is cheaper. Greener technologies support productivity growth and innovation, and put firms and sectors on more innovative trajectories that are ultimately even if they're costly in initial stages, will be put them in a more competitive position over time. And so, and that's before even talking about all of the development benefits of greater resilience and reduced vulnerability to climate change and higher temperatures, which are hard to value, but we've estimated that those costs are extremely large for the Asia Pacific region. So I look at it more as a win-win. I think there's a lot of research which tries to look at these trade-offs and doesn't find much evidence to say that promoting carbon decarbonization efforts or even carbon pricing efforts, which you think is like a tax, there's not much evidence to say that this actually substantially slows growth and development.
Thank you, Albert. So before we close today's webinar, we would like to invite you to join our Asian Impact webinar, Asian Development Policy Lecture by Joel Spicer, to be held on 11th September, Thursday, 2 to 3 p.m. Manila time, on site in ADB headquarters and also via Zoom. Please do check out the AIW web page and the Chief Economist's X account for more updates. Thank you very much for your participation. See you soon.